I was ripped out of sleep by what sounded like a jet engine crash landing in my backyard. Groggy and half-blind, I stumbled to the window, only to see a line of halogen floodlights blasting across my fields like an alien invasion. In the glow, bulldozers, excavators, and surveyors bustled about like they were racing against a doomsday clock. One machine was laying down track, actual train track, across my property. I yanked on pants, grabbed my boots without socks, and ran out in disbelief. There, under the artificial daylight, a sign read, "Future site of Greenridge Community Rail Hub proudly sponsored by the HOA." That was my land. And that sign? That was my war horn. The next few minutes were a blur of yelling, unanswered questions, and the sick realization that no one out there cared who I was. One guy in a reflective vest literally told me, without flinching, "Sorry sir, this is HOA-approved land. We're just following blueprints." I asked him if he had the deed. He said, "Don't need one. HOA handles that." I stared at him, slack-jawed, trying to comprehend how a group of overzealous suburbanites thought they could pave a commuter rail terminal through private land without even knocking on the front door. It would have been funny if it wasn't so stupidly infuriating. Back inside, I paced like a caged bear while dialing every emergency contact I had. No one answered except Mike, my cousin and occasional hunting buddy. When I told him the HOA was building a train station behind my house, he laughed so hard he dropped the phone. I had to call him back 3 times before he believed I wasn't high or dreaming. Even then, his advice was simple: get a lawyer and get revenge. At that moment, revenge felt like the only logical choice. These people hadn't just ignored me. They had rolled 20 tons of steel onto my land and dared me to do something about it. The next morning, I drove straight to the HOA office in town, dressed in the same dusty clothes from the night before. The receptionist, a 20-something with pink headphones around her neck, looked up and blinked at me like I was speaking ancient Greek when I demanded to see the president. Karen Dunlap, president of the Greenridge HOA, strutted out like she was expecting royalty. Blonde bob, white heels, clipboard like a sword. She smiled like a banker about to foreclose on a lemonade stand. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just asked her if she was aware that the construction crew was laying track on my land. Her response? She actually laughed and said, "Oh that? Ethan, you've always been a little off the grid. The survey shows that portion technically falls under common utility development. We're fast-tracking a community shuttle system. Isn't that exciting?" I told her no, it wasn't exciting. It was criminal. She said, "Well, maybe next time, don't let your weeds grow past the fence line. It gets confusing for the planners." I asked her again if she had documentation showing the HOA owned my land. She said, "The community comes first. I suggest you let it go. The station will increase your property value." That was when I decided I wasn't going to get mad. I was going to get even. But not the loud, messy kind of even. The slow, surgical, legally airtight kind of revenge. The kind that makes them wish they had just built a sandbox instead. Back at my home office, I dug through every file, deed, topography map, and utility bill I'd saved since buying this property 7 years ago. The records were crystal clear. The plot behind my house, where the construction was happening, belonged solely to me. Not the HOA. Not the city. Just me. It wasn't even part of the Greenridge subdivision. In fact, I had deliberately bought just outside the HOA boundary to avoid dealing with their nonsense. Somehow, they had decided to annex my land without paperwork, court orders, or even basic respect. I called the county records office and got connected with a clerk named Jean. She was sharp, fast-talking, and had zero patience for HOA drama. When I told her what was going on, she immediately pulled up the parcel map and confirmed everything I already knew. "Yep, you're not even within their jurisdiction. This isn't just a mistake. This is actionable trespassing." I asked if I could get that in writing. She emailed the certified land deed and GIS map within 10 minutes. That was my first weapon. Now, I knew a normal person might have filed a complaint, maybe sued them, or marched down there with a sheriff and had the whole site shut down. But I had something better. Something more permanent. See, about 5 years ago, I'd helped an old college buddy, Nate, run logistics for a freight line. I wasn't just an engineer. I specialized in infrastructure systems. Nate now oversaw operations for Titan Freight Logistics, one of the largest cargo carriers in the Southwest. He owed me big for saving his $1 million cargo deal back then. I shot him a text. Still looking for a central loading station near the I-85 corridor? His reply came in less than 2 minutes. Are you kidding? Been praying for one. That night, as the HOA's hired contractors worked under the illusion that they were building a cozy community rail platform, I sat back in my office chair, sipping whiskey, drafting a commercial lease agreement. I pulled blueprints from my archive, modified the loading dock specs, and added provisions for 24/7 operation, flood lighting, livestock carriers, diesel engine permits, and maximum horn frequency compliance. By the time the sun rose, I had a 10-year lease agreement drafted and ready for Nate's legal team. The kicker? Titan Freight agreed to pay me triple market value for the land lease because the platform was already halfway built, at the HOA's expense. They'd saved him 6 months of construction. As far as Nate was concerned, it was a win. As far as I was concerned, it was a declaration of war, signed, sealed, and delivered by Freight. The final piece of the puzzle was quietly letting Karen believe everything was still under control. I knew if she caught wind of the Freight deal too early, she'd try to sabotage it. So I smiled at her during morning walks, waved when she passed by in her little golf cart, and even complimented her new banner. Coming soon, Greenridge Rail. She was planning an official launch next month. That gave me just enough time to line everything up. Because when the first train rolled through, 3 engines deep, horns screaming, and carrying 24 cars full of gravel and livestock, I wanted her front and center, scissors in hand, thinking she was cutting a ribbon. When in reality, she just opened a nightmare she could never shut down. The next morning, I headed straight to the county courthouse, armed with every document I had. Deed records, GIS maps, land surveys, even old photos showing my fence line stretching years before the HOA ever existed. I wasn't about to let some bored suburban warlord pave over my property like I was a squatter in my own backyard. I met with the zoning commissioner, a no-nonsense guy named Feldman who wore suspenders and had an obvious disdain for HOA shenanigans. When I showed him what was happening, he took one look at the documents and said, "Well, hell. They built a terminal on private land. This is gonna be a circus." I asked if the county would intervene. He leaned back in his chair, cracked his knuckles and said, "Not unless you sue them or they try to file permits retroactively. Until then, it's your property. Do with it what you want." That was all the confirmation I needed. The freight deal was already moving behind the scenes, and I was about to turn this accidental train station into the HOA's worst nightmare. Nate called that afternoon and told me his legal team had already reviewed the draft lease and loved it. Titan Freight was eager to secure the location. They'd been searching for a central offloading point in this region for months, and the pre-built platform was a dream come true for them. They were ready to sign within days. All I had to do was file the lease and notify the local transportation office. The station would be up and running in record time. I told him to proceed and warned him to prepare for some resistance. He just laughed and said, "We've dealt with worse than nosy neighbors. Try angry ranchers with dynamite." I knew then that I had the right people backing me. Meanwhile, Karen had begun organizing the grand opening for her dream project. She sent out glossy invitations featuring a mock-up of what she thought the commuter station would look like: quaint wooden benches, flower planters, a little smoothie bar. It looked like something out of a Hallmark movie. In reality, the steel siding was already welded on, Industrial lighting was being installed by the Titan Freight subcontractors I discreetly hired through a local firm, and the ticket booth had quietly been refitted into a logistics control office. Karen either didn't notice or was too drunk on HOA authority to question what was unfolding around her. By Wednesday, a few residents began asking questions. One neighbor, Greg, approached me while I was walking my dog. He looked uneasy and said, "Hey, Ethan, is it true the station's gonna be freight, not passenger?" I played it cool. "That depends on who's asking and how much noise they can tolerate." He laughed nervously but didn't press. I could tell rumors were spreading, and the air was beginning to thicken with paranoia. I didn't mind. Let them guess. Let Karen bask in her delusion a little longer. The more clueless they were when the first shipment arrived, the more poetic the payoff. 2 days later, the HOA filed a code violation notice on me. It claimed I had improper commercial usage of residential land, citing increased activity and suspicious electrical installations. I nearly laughed when I read it. They had no jurisdiction. I wasn't part of their community, and even if I was, the freight deal had already been cleared by the city. I faxed the notice straight to Titan Freight's legal office, and within hours, Karen received a cease and desist letter so thick it probably dented her mailbox. The HOA didn't realize they were poking a legal bear the size of a locomotive. Karen, however, doubled down. That Saturday, she arrived at the construction site in her usual high heels, flanked by 2 clipboard-carrying board members who looked like they'd walked off a movie set about government incompetence. She marched right up to one of the workers, who was actually a Titan Freight logistics coordinator, and demanded to know why he was installing warehouse-grade LED lights instead of warm ambient fixtures. He stared at her like she was speaking underwater, then handed her a permit file with the freight company's seal. She snatched it, flipped through the first few pages, and turned ghost white. Without another word, she stormed off, leaving her minions standing there like confused chickens. That night, I received a knock at my door. It was one of the HOA board members, Roger, looking pale and sweaty. He asked if we could talk. I invited him in and offered him a drink. He declined but paced in front of the fireplace for a minute before blurting, "We didn't know it was your land." Karen said it was community property. She showed us a map. She said you'd signed off. I leaned forward and said, "Did you ever see my signature?" He hesitated. "No. But she said she'd spoken to you." I shook my head and told him the truth. Karen had lied. I owned the land. Always had. And now, thanks to their arrogance, I'd leased it to a national freight company. He sat down slowly, processing the betrayal. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Over the next week, the platform was transformed completely. Security gates were installed. Concrete barriers were laid. The HOA banners mysteriously vanished overnight, and in their place, large signs with the Titan Freight logo appeared like magic. Karen tried to tear one down herself but was stopped by a worker who politely informed her she'd be trespassing if she crossed the new chain-link line. Her jaw practically hit the ground. She threatened to call the police, but they never came, probably because she'd already filed too many frivolous complaints for them to care. When the final inspection came through, Titan Freight received green light approval for full 24/7 operations. The warehouse doors were mounted. Floodlights were activated. A horn test was conducted that could probably be heard 3 counties away. That night, Karen sent out a mass email to the community claiming external interference has temporarily delayed the launch of the commuter rail. I nearly choked laughing when I read it. She still didn't have the guts to admit she'd built a cargo terminal for pigs and steel drums. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get any better, I received an invitation in the mail. A glossy, professionally printed invite to the Grand Ribbon Cutting Ceremony, Greenridge Rail Station. It was still happening. Karen, in all her delusional glory, had decided to hold a public ceremony for a station she no longer controlled. I RSVP'd yes. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I wanted to be there when the train rolled in. Not to watch the freight unload, but to watch Karen unravel. That ceremony was going to be the moment everything exploded, and I'd be standing there with front-row tickets to the disaster she built with her own arrogance. The morning of the grand opening felt like the calm before a very loud, metal-filled storm. The sky was clear, birds chirped, and Karen was already out early, directing last-minute decorations around the platform. I watched from my back porch, sipping my coffee like it was a front-row seat to a comedy show. There were balloons tied to the railings, a red ribbon stretched across the platform, folding chairs set up for the guests, and a big "Welcome to Greenridge Rail Station" banner fluttering in the breeze. I couldn't help but admire the irony. She had no clue the station she built with HOA funds was no longer hers. And the irony was about to arrive in the form of 3 220-ton locomotives hauling more noise and chaos than this neighborhood had ever heard. Around 10 a.m., the guests began to arrive. Local news vans rolled up first, cameras and boom mics ready. Then came the mayor's assistant, a couple of city council members, and about 50 or so residents, all curious and confused. Many of them had received invitations just like I had, but they weren't exactly sure what they were celebrating anymore. Rumors had been swirling, and you could feel the tension underneath the awkward handshakes and phony smiles. People were whispering. Some pointed toward the newly installed freight signs and industrial wiring. A few tried to ask Karen about it, but she brushed them off with her usual tight smile and vague promises of technical upgrades. I had timed everything perfectly. Just after 10:30, as Karen stood on the platform with a pair of oversized golden scissors in hand and the camera crew signaled they were rolling, the ground began to rumble. At first, people assumed it was just passing vibrations or distant traffic. But then the rumble grew louder. The glasses on the refreshment table started to shake. Someone dropped their phone. A child pointed toward the tracks and shouted, "What's that?" And then it happened. The horn blast pierced the air like a battle cry. A triple-engine freight train barreled toward the platform, slowing slightly but still moving with undeniable force. Massive steel cars clanked and hissed, each one loaded with raw materials. Scrap metal, gravel, machinery parts, even a livestock container filled with bleeding goats and pigs. The screech of metal brakes echoed through the neighborhood as the train came to a halt, right beside the carefully placed ribbon and terrified guests. Dust clouds rose. Decorations blew away. One of the banners snapped in half. And right at the center of it all stood Karen, frozen mid-pose, scissors still raised in her hand, her face shifting from pride to panic in a matter of seconds. The Titan freight team leaped into action, operating cranes, lowering loading ramps, and shouting instructions into radios. Forklifts began unloading cargo. Goats started bleating like mad. A pungent wave of livestock smell rolled over the crowd. Karen stepped back, coughing, as the camera crew frantically tried to adjust their equipment. The mayor's assistant looked confused. A city councilman tried to speak but stopped when a pig trotted past his shoes. Meanwhile, I stepped onto the platform, wearing a Titan Freight-issued jacket and holding a copy of the lease agreement in my hand. I walked straight up to Karen, who looked like she had seen a ghost wearing a hard hat. "Perfect timing," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You really outdid yourself with the ribbon. I was worried we wouldn't have a proper welcome ceremony for our first freight drop." Karen stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She finally managed, "This is supposed to be a commuter station." I handed her a copy of the lease. "It's not. It's private property, leased to Titan Freight for a 24/7 logistics hub. You're standing on commercial ground right now. Shall I explain the terms for the camera?" She looked down at the paperwork, her eyes scanning faster and faster, her face going pale. I turned to the camera and smiled. "Thanks to the Greenridge HOA for funding the construction. Really made the setup easy." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people laughed. Others yelled. One woman began filming everything on her phone, narrating like she was a news anchor. And here we have Karen, caught in 4K, realizing she just spent community funds to build a loading dock for pigs. A man next to her whispered, "This is going straight to Reddit." The camera crew, sensing gold, stayed locked on Karen, who was visibly trembling. One of the freight workers offered her a safety vest. She didn't respond. After a few minutes, the mayor's assistant pulled me aside and asked, "Is this even legal?" I nodded. "Every inch of it. The land's mine. The permits are approved. And the lease is signed. They built it without permission. I just made good use of what they left behind." He looked at Karen, who was still clutching the scissors like they might save her from public humiliation, and muttered, "Well, that's a first." Karen finally tried to regain control. She grabbed a megaphone and announced, "This was not the plan. We have been sabotaged." But no one was buying it. The crowd had seen the paperwork, the permits, the train, the cargo. Her narrative was dead on arrival. People began walking out. Some booed. Others clapped for me. A child offered me a high five. Karen stormed off the platform, nearly slipping in a puddle of animal waste. The rest of the day, trains continued to arrive. The festival atmosphere Karen had planned was quickly replaced by the rhythm of machinery, the smell of industrial work, and the sounds of a fully operational freight hub. Titan freight crews offered guests tours of the loading system. Kids climbed on cargo pallet. A vendor truck showed up to sell hot dogs. What was supposed to be Karen's big moment had turned into a Titan Freight promotional event, and a neighborhood-wide embarrassment for the HOA. That night, Karen sent out a frantic community email claiming that unauthorized individuals had hijacked the ceremony and that legal action would be taken. She also accused me of violating noise ordinances, health codes, and zoning rules. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, who simply replied, "Let her dig. Every step she takes helps us bury them deeper." The next morning, HOA board members started showing up at my door, one by one. Some were angry. Others were sheepish. A few openly admitted they had been kept in the dark by Karen and wanted nothing more to do with her. One guy even offered to help install traffic signage near the loading zone. I didn't hold grudges. At least not against the ones who didn't pretend they were in charge of land they never owned. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling. She filed a complaint with the city inspector, but he visited the site, looked over the documents, and left without comment. She tried calling the media, but by then, the footage of her humiliating moment had already gone viral online, with thousands of shares and comments. The top one read, "She built it and the freight came." Another said, "Karen got railroaded, literally." I knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to walk away quietly. But she was losing ground, both legally and socially. The residents were waking up to her lies. The HOA board was turning against her. And with each train that rolled in, horns blaring and lights flashing, the reminder grew louder. She had lost this war before it even began. And the best part? I didn't lay a single track. She did. All I did was steer the train in the right direction. By the end of the week, Karen had become a local legend, though not in the way she wanted. Videos of the train's grand arrival and her frozen expression had spread like wildfire. Memes of her holding those ridiculous golden scissors were everywhere. One showed her photoshopped onto a cargo crate with the caption, "Next day delivery, Karen's pride." Another had her mid-scream with the words, "HOA president learns about property rights." The community was buzzing, and not just from the freight horns that now echoed through the neighborhood at all hours. But the real celebration was still to come. I had an idea. If she wanted a public event, I'd give her one. Only this time, the spotlight would be mine. I contacted Titan Freight's PR team and suggested we host an open house, complete with a freight festival. They loved the idea. A perfect way to market the new hub, attract local business interest, and flip public opinion in our favor even further. We planned everything within 72 hours. There would be guided tours, a bounce house for kids made from spare crates, and a barbecue station run by a local vendor who was all too happy to join the cause once he learned it was HOA-sponsored land turned public spectacle. We even printed shirts that read, "Welcome to Freightland, powered by Karen's approval." The day of the festival arrived and the turnout was far bigger than I expected. Hundreds of people showed up. Local vendors set up booths along the access road, Titan Freight employees handed out branded merchandise, and the mayor himself made an appearance, shaking my hand and joking, "Well, I guess this is one way to solve the housing problem, for livestock, anyway." Kids rode mini trains around the yard, parents snapped photos beside cranes and engine cars, and a drone buzzed overhead capturing footage for a promotional video. The smell of barbecue filled the air, mixed with the occasional waft of diesel and hay. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't suburban. It was real, gritty, and completely out of the HOA's control. Karen, of course, showed up. She came storming in around noon wearing a blazer and heels, like she was heading to a courtroom instead of a logistics yard. She tried to push past the gate, but a security guard stopped her, calmly explaining that the event was on private property and she would need clearance. She snapped that she was the HOA president. The guard politely reminded her that the HOA had no authority here. Her face twisted like she'd swallowed battery acid. She stood outside the chain-link fence for over 20 minutes, pacing like a caged cat, before she finally caught my eye. I walked over slowly, letting her simmer. She launched into a rant the second I got close enough. She accused me of defrauding the neighborhood, ruining the community's image, and weaponizing livestock. I told her calmly that none of it would have happened if she'd followed legal procedure instead of assuming she could seize my land with a garden party smile and a printed banner. She said it was all a misunderstanding. I replied, "A misunderstanding doesn't pour concrete and lay rail lines." She said the HOA would sue. I pulled out a laminated copy of the lease and held it against the fence. "You already tried. Your own board is siding with me now. You're on your own." That seemed to hit her. She stopped yelling. For the first time in weeks, Karen didn't look angry. She looked small. Her eyes flicked to the festival inside, the cheering children, the people taking selfies with forklifts, and the Titan Freight banners flapping in the wind. All of it made possible because she couldn't bother checking a property line. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence around her was louder than any insult I could throw. By the following Monday, Karen filed a personal lawsuit against me in small claims court. She claimed emotional distress, damage to her reputation, and violation of noise ordinances. She even attached printed memes as evidence, blaming me for encouraging them. My lawyer, who had handled actual international shipping disputes, looked at the case and laughed out loud. We filed a motion to dismiss, attaching her own emails, HOA board meeting minutes, and construction approvals with her signature. During the first hearing, the judge skimmed through her paperwork and asked her one question. "Did you build this station on land you didn't own?" Karen tried to spin it. The judge cut her off and said, "Case dismissed. If I were you, I'd stop talking before you give him a reason to countersue." She turned red, mumbled something under her breath, and stormed out. The lawsuit was dead. But the consequences weren't over. Word of her failure spread faster than the freight itself. HOA residents demanded accountability. At the next board meeting, which was packed to the walls, she tried to defend herself, blaming a conspiracy of landowners and industrial forces. The crowd booed. A man in the back yelled, "You built a train station on someone else's property and didn't even say sorry." A woman shouted, "My toddler can't sleep because of the horns, and you told us it was going to be a coffee shop." Another voice, "Resign, Karen." She pounded the gavel so hard it broke in two. And still, they kept shouting. Within a week, a petition circulated calling for Karen's removal. More than 80% of residents signed it. The board scheduled a vote. Karen tried one last stunt, claiming she was the victim of online harassment and needed time off. But the board had had enough. In a closed-door session, They voted her out and replaced her with a quiet but competent woman named Sheila, who immediately announced that the HOA would be reviewing all past actions for legal compliance. I didn't attend the vote. I didn't need to. I sat on my porch, watching the sun set behind the freight yard, listening to the distant rumble of an approaching train. Another shipment, another victory lap. I'd turned their power grab into an economic engine, and they'd handed me the keys without even realizing it. But I wasn't done yet. There was still the matter of financial damage to my property, trespassing, and illegal construction. My lawyer was working on a counterclaim that would make even Karen's hair dye turn white. She'd built her dream project on a lie. Now it was time to send her the bill. That week, I met with Titan Freight executives to discuss expansion. They wanted to add a secondary platform, a loading dock, and a small warehouse. I showed them the adjacent property lines, ones the HOA had considered community green space. Turns out they hadn't paid taxes on it in years. With the right filing, it could be claimed and sold. I told Titan Freight to prepare a bid. If all went well, the HOA wouldn't just lose control of a train station, they'd lose part of their own neighborhood. The irony was delicious. Karen had tried to cement her legacy as the visionary who brought rail access to the community. Instead, she'd become the punchline of the biggest local joke in years. And while she retreated from public life, nursing her bruised ego and probably fantasizing about revenge, I continued building the very thing she feared most. A freight empire in the middle of suburbia, powered by her arrogance and funded by her mistakes. And it was only going to get louder. The freight yard was fully operational now, pulsing like a living machine day and night. Trains rolled in on a schedule that respected nothing except momentum. The screech of metal, the steady hum of engines, the clang of shifting cargo, all of it had become the new soundtrack of the neighborhood. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone, but not nearly as difficult for me as it was for the residents who had voted for Karen's grand transit vision. They now lived in homes where their backyard conversations were regularly interrupted by train horns and the occasional bleat from a livestock car. As for Karen herself, she had gone quiet, which was strange considering her usual flair for dramatics. After being ousted from her position and losing her case in court, she hadn't been seen for days. But her silence didn't mean the consequences were over. Not for her, and certainly not for the HOA. My lawyer had spent weeks compiling every document, photo, timestamp, and email relevant to the HOA's illegal construction. The damages were real, both physical and financial. They had built on private land without consent, caused disruption to my home and property, and attempted to undermine me with false legal threats. I wasn't about to let them walk away. So we filed a civil suit, not against just Karen, but the HOA as an entity. And the best part? We filed it in the same courthouse where her previous lawsuit had been laughed out of the room. This time, it was my turn to be the plaintiff. When the HOA received notice of the lawsuit, panic rippled through the board. Several of the newer members immediately reached out to me, trying to negotiate a settlement. They begged for a private resolution, claiming they hadn't known what Karen had done until it was too late. I told them I was open to negotiation, but only if they met my conditions. First, they would have to admit fault publicly. Second, they would need to pay for every square foot of construction done on my land, with interest. Third, and perhaps most satisfying of all, they would need to issue a written apology signed by each current board member, including Karen, acknowledging the HOA's unlawful actions and agreeing to a non-interference clause for the remainder of the properties leased to Titan Freight. They balked at first. One board member, clearly still clinging to the fantasy of HOA supremacy, tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding and that I was just milking the situation. I responded by forwarding him video footage of Karen standing proudly on the platform during the ribbon cutting, complete with her speech about transforming the community. I added a note: misunderstanding doesn't pour concrete and invite the press. That shut him up. The next week, I received the signed apology letter. It was pathetic and glorious at the same time, typed in Times New Roman, formatted like a resignation letter, and clearly the result of a lawyer's reluctant approval. But it was mine. I had it framed and hung it in my office right beside the lease agreement. It made a lovely pair. Karen, however, still hadn't shown her face. That changed one evening when I caught her sneaking into the yard around sunset. I was walking the perimeter when I spotted her by the fence, staring at the freight cars as they moved slowly through the yard. Her blazer was gone, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she looked nothing like the power-drunk woman who once tried to annex my property with a clipboard and a smile. When she noticed me, she didn't run. She didn't yell. She just stood there, eyes heavy, as if the fight had long left her. I approached and stopped a few feet away. She looked at the train, then at me. Her voice was barely audible. She said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this." I told her it didn't have to be. If she had just knocked on my door, if she had checked a map, if she had respected the boundary line like any reasonable person, we wouldn't be here. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, then turned and walked away. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Her footsteps were quieter than they'd ever been. With the civil suit settled and the apology signed, I turned my focus to expansion. Titan Freight was thriving at the new location, and they were eager to lock in additional infrastructure. The company made an offer to purchase the unused green space that bordered the current yard, land that the HOA had neglected to pay taxes on for years. With the help of a real estate agent and a little pressure from the county over unpaid dues, the land went up for auction. I placed the highest bid, closed the deal within a week, and doubled the size of the yard. That expansion came with new perks: an administrative office, more storage bays, and a second loading dock designed for specialty cargo. We installed sound barriers along the border to reduce noise complaints, not because I had to, but because it was the right thing to do for the residents who had never supported Karen's reckless power grab. Some of them even started visiting the yard, curious about the operations. I gave them tours. One old man who used to yell at me about zoning rules actually thanked me, saying his son got hired as a forklift operator and it saved their mortgage. The community began to change. The HOA was no longer feared. It was watched, monitored, and held accountable. Sheila, the new president, was fair and transparent. She even asked me to help draft new policies on land disputes to prevent another Karen-style catastrophe. I agreed on one condition: they dissolve the HOA's authority over any land not explicitly titled within their boundary. Sheila accepted. The policy passed. And just like that, the paper kingdom Karen had tried to rule was reduced to its actual size. 1 year after the first train arrived, we hosted a celebration. Titan Freight sent executives from their corporate office. The mayor returned to give a short speech about economic growth. Kids played on modified train cars, local bands performed, and the once disputed yard pulsed with life and movement. I stood near the edge of the platform as the sun dipped below the trees, watching a freight car loaded with fresh-cut timber roll past. A small plaque had been mounted nearby at my request. It read, "Built by arrogance. Saved by rail." Beneath it, a line from the lease agreement: "Property rights prevail." I didn't see Karen again after that. Someone said she moved out of town, maybe back to her sister's place upstate. Others claimed she was trying to start over in a new HOA under a different name. But wherever she went, I hoped she'd remember one thing: that trying to steamroll over the wrong person might just get you run over by your own train. I hadn't just protected my land. I'd turned her act of trespassing into the very thing that kept her up at night. And in doing so, I hadn't just won a war. I'd changed the rules entirely.